So we would like to acknowledge and honor the original peoples of the Chicagoland area, the three Fire Confederacy, the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe nations and other tribal nations, and the many indigenous people who call it home, past, present, and future. We acknowledge and honor you. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Rosa Cabrera, director of the UIC Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this beautiful sunny afternoon for the start of the second Climates of Inequality online series. Last fall, the series presented local leaders working on environmental and climate justice in the Chicago area. And you can access those presentations in the LCC website. I believe someone is going to be putting the link on the chat. And for this fall, we're extending the conversation to environmental and climate justice advocates from across the country and abroad. So we will be hosting 4 speakers who will share frameworks and solutions that utilize a justice and equity lens, integrating social and economic issues to address toxic pollution and combat the climate crisis that affects the most vulnerable, Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color, and in particular, the women, the very old and young, LGBTQ, the disabled, and undocumented. While there are many reasons why people decide to leave the place they call home, climate change is a significant factor affecting the livelihoods of vulnerable people that lack the resources to cope with an increasingly hostile environment. As their land can't produce enough food, clean water becomes even more limited, and intense climate-related disasters destroy their homes. It is projected that the displacement of people, many who will be trying to move across national borders, will intensify. I think this is a fact now that we are all seeing. But meanwhile, we're seeing anti-immigrant sentiments in the rise in the United States and other rich countries around the globe. And governments are responding with an increase in militarization and surveillance that has opened doors to pro-corporate agendas with solutions that exploit and intensify existing inequalities. This is what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism. And our presenter today argues is climate adaptation for the rich and powerful. Today's presentation will help us connect the dots between all of this. But before we start with the presentation, I would like to a few shout outs to Professor Patricia Macias for joining forces with the LCC to make this program happen, to our partners, the Humanities Action Lab, where the Climates of Inequality project resides, and organizations, Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization known as Alvejo, who have been working with us for the past 3 years in the Climates of Inequality project. To our co-sponsors, the UIC Sustainability Fee, Global Migration Working Group, Latin American and Latino Studies, Social Justice Initiative, the Department of Anthropology, CIMAS Project, Freshwater Lab, Great Cities Institute, Honors College, Las Ganas Project, and Museums and Exhibition Studies. And to the student panelists in my environmental and climate justice class, they are Jordan Alcantar, Brittany Howard, Cristal Ramirez, and Isabel Tamas. The presentation today will be about 35 to 40 minutes long, followed by a short Q&A conversation between the students that I mentioned and our guest speakers. So now I am delighted to pass the mic to Professor Macias, who will introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. It's been really awesome to work with you on this. And so it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Todd Miller has been reporting from international border zones for over 25 years. I had the honor of meeting him almost 20 years ago when I was a student and he was doing really important political work on the Arizona-Mexico border. And he was immensely supportive of me as I was starting my research on that looks at this blending of domestic and border policing on the US-Mexico border. And so Todd went on to become an award-winning independent journalist and writer, and has written about various sort of border regions globally. He's authored 4 books. The first is The Border Patrol Nation, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Homeland Security, where he was really looking at the expansion from the border inward and outward in some ways. But that book, I think of it in terms of the internalization of the US-Mexico border. He then went on to publish Empire of Borders. I'm actually using this book in my class right now, The Expansion of the US Border Around the World. That's on the externalization of borders. He also published Storming the Wall, Climate Change, Migration, and Homeland Security, that covers those connections that Professor Cabrera was talking about between migration, climate change, and corporate investment in border security, and how this matters for environmental justice movements. His most recent book is Build Bridges, Not Walls, A Journey to a World Without Borders. And in this book, I think Todd is really boldly reflecting on the ways in which the current system of nation states that we have, this taken for granted system, sort of creates the problems that drive immigration, and how the abolition of borders could make the world more a sustainable place for everyone. He invites us to imagine a borderless world and how it could help solve a lot of the kind of global emergencies that are threatening our collective survival. I encourage you to check out his website and his Twitter feed, which I'll put in the chat. And so we're so excited and honored to have you here, Todd. Thank you. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to say and to learn from you. So, and welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It was a very generous and nice introduction, and it has been my honor to know you for all these years and learn from you and learn from your work. So thank you for that, and thanks to everyone for helping organize this presentation. Particularly the people I talked to the most, Rosa and Jocelyn, and I know there was others as well. So many thanks. It's really good to be here virtually. I'm coming into Chicago from Tucson, Arizona, where I live. So we thought it might be a personal visit at one point, but alas, the era of the pandemic is upon us. So here I come from Tucson. And but anyhow, regardless, it's great to be here. And today I'm going to discuss 2 of my books, storming the 2 of the ones that Patricia mentioned, Storming the Wall, which is connecting the dots between climate change, displacement, and borders, and Build Bridges, Not Walls, which is the newest book. I'm going to put both of those books kind of together in a presentation. My presentation, I'm going to rely on in a lot of ways. The style of the book is very storytelling, and so I want to do my presentation along with that spirit, and I'll do my best to combine both of these books as we progress. So thanks again. And where I wanted to start was with my 2017 book, Storming the Wall. And actually in the precise passage where I begin the book. And I begin the book on the island of Marinduque in the Philippines. And I'm walking along the beach on this island. This island is an important island for me because it's the island where my grandmother is from. And it was actually my first time going there to the actual island. And I was there also to do research for Storming the Wall. And I talked to, I guess they were called the disaster specialist, or there was a person in the provincial government who focused on disasters and who was looking into the future. And one of the things that he was focused on was sea level rise. So he told me to go to this particular section of the beach. And I started walking down this particular section, and lo and behold, I come across a house where the waves are lapping in and out of the house. And mind you, on this day in the Philippines, way in the north, pretty far away, there was a typhoon, but pretty far away, but enough that the sea was stormy. There was a lot of clouds, it was spitting rain, and there was a small surge of waves. And these waves went in and out of this house, in and out. And I remember sitting there and watching it. And on retrospect, I guess, I've seen a lot of things that you could attribute, or you could say, well, that, climate change has something to do with that. But to my knowledge, that was one of the first times where I actually literally looked at something and said, oh my God, I'm literally watching the sea wreck a house. And then just a few minutes after that, a man was walking on the beach, and I actually started talking to him. And he was a fisherman, and he started telling me about how much the sea had been rising over the years. And he even pointed out to a buoy, and that was kind of wobbling in the sea. It looked about 20 feet away, and he said, "Well, the shore used to be there." And then he said, "We've actually had to move our community back." And then soon after that, another man walked out holding a child. And the child looked probably about 1 year old and had long black hair, or hair that was pretty long and black. And I remember looking at the child and thinking, wow, if they're already moving the community back, what did that what did that mean for this child's future, for his life? Like, was he going to be able to was he going to be able to stay in this small community, or would he in fact have to go to another place like OAC, which is the capital of Marinduque? By the way, are you hearing me correctly? Because I'm okay, good. Because I was seeing some messages that BOAC, the capital of the province, or Manila, the capital of the Philippines, or would the child have to cross borders eventually? And essentially that's really how the book begins, looking at the connections between what is the world and what is the world before us, and connecting the dots between three dynamics that are all on the rise: climate change and its impacts that we're seeing more and more and more across the world, displacement of people, which is getting, you see it rising. There are more and more and more displacement around the world, and borders. And if you look at borders, there are more and more and more and more borders around the world as well. And so looking at these three dynamics and putting them together, that's what I was examining in Storming the Wall. So to fast forward to another section of the book. Now, mind you, in the book Storming the Wall, I did travel to a number of different places. I went to not only the Philippines, but I did a lot of research on the US-Mexico border. I went to the 2015 Climate Summit in Paris, among other places. But another place that I went was Central America, and the Mexico-Guatemala borderlands. And one of those places that people may or may not be familiar with is a town called Tenosique. Tenosique is about 20 miles from the Guatemalan border. It's in Mexico, in the state of Tabasco. When I was in Tenosique, I was staying at a shelter there. The shelter is called La 72, or 72, the 72 shelter. And one day I went out into the train, where the train yard is. And the train yard is where many people would hop on the trains and go north, maybe to another part of Mexico, or maybe to the United States. So when I was in the train yard, I ended up meeting three what turned out to be small farmers from Honduras. Those I sat and talked to those three farmers for quite a while, and they told me that they left where they were from because, quote unquote, there was no rain. There was no rain. With no rain, there was no harvest. With no harvest, there was a crisis. And they had plans of going all the way to the United States. So it turns out the part of Honduras where they were from, it was pretty devastated by a drought that year. The rains didn't come, the harvest wilted, and they were not alone. There was about 400,000 other people in Honduras who were impacted by this. And 1 million people, if you look at the whole kind of dry corridor area in Central America. And the dry corridor is a swath of territory I'm sure many people are familiar with, that is getting where the rains are becoming more unpredictable, where sometimes they don't even come. It's becoming more arid in certain ways, and has been suffering intensifying droughts over the last 10 years. And this was actually told to me also by a climate scientist by the name of Chris Castro, who's been doing who had been doing modeling in Central America around the droughts specifically. And his conclusion was that Central America was ground zero, quote unquote, for climate change and impacts of climate change in the Americas. And so this is coming, I was there in 2015 and doing research in 2016, 2015. Storming the Wall was published in 2017. But of course, since then, there's a number of updates that I could mention too. Particularly, I should say, like when I was after I interviewed those smart farmers in the Tenosique train yard, I wondered, well, how many more people were in similar situations that that we didn't know about. And as the years have gone by, in 2018, for example, there were severe droughts in Central America, and so much to the fact that Customs and Border Protection, and that's CBP, that's the parent agency of the U.S. Border Patrol, said that people were leaving Guatemala more because of food insecurity than any other reason. And what they were taking was data of people that they arrested crossing the border and locating where they're from. And they turned out they were from particularly drought-stricken areas of Guatemala. And also the World Food Program in 2018, at the end of that year, in a report about the droughts in Central America, not looking exclusively at Guatemala, but looking at the whole they're looking at the dry corridor. They calculated that nearly 2 million people were suffering hunger after 2018. And then 2020 was particularly bad as well. So what happened in 2020 was there was unstable or unpredictable weather again. So there was crop loss and harvest losses in many different places. But then that was compounded by the 2 hurricanes, Category 4 hurricanes that hit the coasts of Nicaragua and Honduras at the end of 2020. And those hurricanes, coupled with the droughts, coupled with the kind of fallout that was happening with COVID, came together, and a report that the World Food Program did in 2021, in January of 2021, estimated that hunger went up from 2 million to 8 million, nearly quadrupled from the end of 2018 to at the beginning of 2021. And they also where they did a survey in the dry corridor area, particularly, where they asked people if you had concrete plans to migrate north. And the numbers went from 8% in 2018 to 15% in 2020, at the beginning of 2021. So that nearly doubled. And then if you look at the statistics that are done by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, that for Honduras and Guatemala in 2020, there was nearly 1 million people displaced in Honduras due to disaster, and 339,000 people in Guatemala for the same reasons. And so those sorts of dynamics that I was seeing when I interviewed the farmers in the Tenosique train yard have only, it seemed to me, have only intensified since then. And this is not only, this is looking at Central America in particular, but also globally. The IDMC, or the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the group that I just mentioned, they estimate that globally, nearly 25 million people per year since 2008 have been displaced due to that disaster, and what they say is highly likely influenced by climate change. And so those sorts of numbers of climate displacement are not a thing of the future. They're happening as we speak. But it should, as I was contemplating, whether or not other people, that when I was interviewing the farmers, another thing to keep in mind, and Rosa mentioned this right at the beginning during the introduction, was that there's multiple factors, right? You always have, it's hard, it's very difficult to parse and say, oh, there's this one reason why people are leaving, why people are migrating, right? There's always multiple converging factors. In fact, Christian Parenti, a sociologist who wrote a book called Tropic of Chaos, he has a theoretical framework he calls the Catastrophic Convergence, and in which he looks at all these different crises that are often siloed, like a economic crisis or a political crisis or a social crisis, and they all kind of converge together. And there's an increasing what he calls ecological crisis, which has to do fueled by climate change, that is coming in and converging. So there's often multiple factors that are at work and at play here, and that's really important to keep in mind, because that's why you have to think of all these other injustices that are happening in the world that need to be dealt with alongside of climate change. But for the purposes of this talk, we'll keep it more focused on trying to parse out what this is and how much climate is affecting. And there have been reports that prognosticate, that forecast many people on the move in the future. One just came out from the World Bank that looks at 2050, and according to their report, 216 million people from 6 different regions will be displaced, and they're looking at internal displacement primarily, displaced internally, so moving and migrating internally by 2050. And then there's other reports out there. There's one from, I think it's called the Ecological Threat Indicator or something like that just came out at the end of last year. That predicts that if things stay the same, there could be 1.2 billion people displaced by 2050. So you can see that there's a wide ranging numbers. There's debate about what it will be, and at the end of the day, it's the future, right? The future is unpredictable. There's many things that can change. A lot of these forecasts look at different variables, like if we cut down on emissions, if you cut down on emissions, like what would this be? This scenario, there would be less displacement. Some forecasts see that there is a correlation between cutting down. Oh shit, I just got that message again. Are you hearing me again? Are you hearing me? Okay, good. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my microphone. So the display, so when you look at all these different numbers and the potential futures, it's very much unwritten, but at the same time, I want to pose the question to all of you, like when you think of climate change and you think of the historic highest emitters of climate change, and what do you think these high emitters of climate change are doing about these, predicted problems, or or what's being already prognosticated by IDMC and other places? And the highest emitting historic country is the United States. The United States is responsible for 30%, according to the climate inequality calculator, 30% of all historic emissions going back to 1850, much higher than any other country. And second place is China, but I think it's around 14%. And if you take the total of the European Union for historic emissions, it's actually around 20%, but the individual countries are less. But these countries, what are they doing? Well, if you look at the United States, there's not really a talk about a climate refugee status. There's not, like, there's been talk since 2010 of climate financing, which is putting money into climate adaptation programs for countries that are the most vulnerable countries. And if you compare, and I'm giving you a sneak preview of a report I'm writing actually right now, but if you compare border and immigration enforcement budgets in the United States to the amount of money they're putting into climate financing, it's nearly a ratio of 17-1 in favor of border and immigration enforcement. So my contention in storming the wall, and my contention until this shifts, is that from the United States point of view, and I will say from the point of view of the highest historic emitters, this is the climate adaptation plan, as Rosa also mentioned at the beginning. The climate adaptation plan for the rich and the powerful is to build walls, to build border enforcement, to put in surveillance technologies, create border patrols, not only in the United States, but across the world. And just for one thing, across the world, the border has grown significantly. Borders have grown. If you look at when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, there were 15 border walls around the world, and now there are 70, and 2/3 of those were erected after 9/11. So they're coming in. There's an acceleration to this kind of global enforcement regime, and of course, people who are displaced by climate change and a number of different other factors are getting caught up in this. And so from there, I'm going to shift over to my other book, which I'm going to kind of segue. I'm going to keep on the theme, but talk a little bit about my other book, Build Bridges, Not Walls. So the beginning of Build Bridges, Not Walls. This is the book that just came out. It came out in April. So it's fresh off the presses, I guess. Not really. I guess April now is, and the way things go now, yesterday seems like 100 years ago. So, but it came out in April. It's my newest book, and in this book, to illustrate what it's about, let me relay how it begins as well. And in this book, I begin in the southern Arizona. I'm driving on the Tohono Nation, which are the indigenous people that inhabited most of southern Arizona and deep into Mexico. I was driving along a dirt road, and a man came out the side of the road. We're in the desert, so I see a landscape of Ocotillo, of Saguaro, and all of a sudden a man pops out, he comes off the side of the road and he's waving his arms in distress. And so I stop the car and I pull over and I roll down the window, and I ask him if he wants some water, and he says yes. And I had a bottle of water and I gave it to him. But I should mention first, because I was just coming down from what is known as the Baba Kivari Peak, of the Baba Kivari mountain range, and I had just gone up to the peak with a Tohono elder by the name of David Garcia, and we were walking up, and I still remember going up to the peak, which is a sacred peak for the Atum. And I remember like looking back as we were like hiking and looking again through the desert landscape, which is utterly beautiful for people that haven't been to Southern Arizona. And just seeing the saguaro, the ocotillo, the landscape, but from a high perspective. So you could see the big sky, and you see mountain ranges just going off into the distance, like distant waves. And it's just one of those moments of beauty, right? And I'm looking at this, and it occurs to me, I'm probably looking into Mexico. We're 20 miles to the north of Mexico, so I'm probably looking right into Mexico, but you can't see it because you can't see the border, right? You can't see it from up there. There's no border. There's a sort of kind of liberatory moment of thinking of a borderless world, even if it was fleeting, of thinking, wow, this could be kind of what it looks like. And that borderless world, of course, as soon as I was down there and I was handing Juan Carlos is the name of the man that came off the side of the road, handing him the bottle, and he drank down the bottle, that borderless world kind of went away, because I asked him if there's anything else I could do for him. And then he said, can you give me a ride to the next town? And then that's when I hesitated. And the hesitation is really where the book, it was like the irritation of where the book Build Bridges Not Walls came from, because I hesitated, because that world of no borders became the world of borders. And because of these decades of being on the border and reporting on the border, I knew it was out there. I knew that the green striped Border Patrol vehicle was probably patrolling nearby. I knew that the increases of the apparatus, the enforcement apparatus, where you from 1994, the Border for Border and Immigration and Budget was $1.5 billion. And in 2021, with the first year of Biden, it's nearly $25 billion. And the 1994 budget is from the INS, or Immigration and Naturalization Service, and the 2021 annual budget is from, if you just take CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and put those numbers together, $25 billion. Never has it been this high. The budget's rate go up every year after year after year after year. And I recently did a calculation of how much money was spent just on CBP and ICE from the implementation of the Department of Homeland Security. Its first year was 2003. So if you take 2003 to 2021, it comes to 300, and I think, gosh, don't quote me on this now, I'm forgetting exactly, but it's around $330 billion. $330 billion approximately, just for CBP and ICE. And so as I'm sitting there in the hesitancy, I'm thinking of what that money means, right? It means quintupling the Border Patrol, right, to nearly 21,000. Now it's around 20,000. It means building hundreds of miles of walls and barriers predating Trump and during Trump. It means surveillance technology galore everywhere, including drone systems. There could have been one flying overhead, or they could have been a surveillance tower that had us in its crosshairs that was even 7-8 miles away. That's how far these surveillance towers can see. Or I could have went over an implanted motion sensor with image sensing sensors, and all the kind of complicated technologies that they have. So I'm thinking of all this stuff as I'm hesitating, and because I'm thinking of this because the the way that the smuggling laws go, if you further somebody's presence in the United States, then that's when they can bust you, right? They can bust you with a felony. So that's why I'm hesitating. I'm hesitating thinking of that. And then I'm infuriated by the fact that I'm hesitating. I'm infuriated by it. You know, thinking even in terms of like the values that I learned as a kid, right? The values that if somebody's in need, you help them out. They're very standard values. If you go to most religions, those are very cornerstone to religious values or spiritual values. This idea of hospitality, of helping somebody out who is in need, and there couldn't be any other better example of this. Especially also knowing what we know about the deserts in southwestern United States, right? Since I use 1994 as a year earlier to look at the budgets, because 1994 is when the Prevention through Deterrence Doctrine was implemented on the U.S.-Mexico border. And the whole idea of that doctrine is to put all the technology and the walls and the agents into the cities that were traditional crossing places to blockade them and then force people into the desert areas, like Juan Carlos in that very moment, who was drinking the water. So the deterrent would be the desert itself. People could not travel through it and carry enough water, carry enough food. And that was obviously the case with him. And since then, at least 8,000 remains of people have been found. And these are by the Border Patrol's numbers. So most estimates have it as much more. NOMARDAS, the humanitarian aid organization that works in Southern Arizona, has estimated that it's 3 to 10 times more. And this is also based on the number of families looking for lost loved ones. So the desert has become a humanitarian crisis, as has been pointed out. And so knowing this, as I contemplated, giving Juan Carlos a ride or not, that was also playing into that moment. And so long story short, this is really how Build Bridges Not Walls was born. That led to bringing like 20 some years of doing journalism and writing and being on the border, putting them into like almost a meditation about that, and looking at all the things that you learn from doing this over so many years, and really coming to and then bringing that to so many different people. So I went and just talked to from all kinds of people, and including like philosophers and visionaries and religious people, but also activists and humanitarian aid workers, and plenty of people crossing the border, migrants and refugees, and just a whole wide array, just bringing these questions about the border and what could be done about it. And one sector of people that I talked to were children, including my own children. And the reason I mention this is because really some of the most insightful answers I got about this were from children. And I should mention that in storming the well, when I was in the Philippines, I was also about to have, we were 5 months away from having our first child, who by the time I was writing Build Bridges Not Walls was 4. And he was one of the ones, his name's William, and he's one of the ones I talked to and consulted about this. And one day we were in San Diego, or just south of San Diego, for people who are familiar with that border area, the Border Field Park. And that's the park where you can see the wall going out into the ocean. So the waves literally go through the wall. And while we were there, well, first of all, there was all kinds of surfers, and there was Border Patrol there, and the surfers kept defying the Border Patrol. They went way out by the wall, and they would go cross over back and forth. And
so there's an agent sitting up on the cliff, and he was saying, you'd hear his disembodied voice saying, stop doing, I don't know what he was saying. He didn't say stop doing that, but pretty much that's what he was saying. Like, stop doing that, stop. But when we got there, William, who there, you could see the Tijuana border wall, and there's bollard, which means there's bars, and you can see people on the other side. And William actually started running towards the wall because people were waving, and he's going to talk to the people waving. And as he was running, the Border Patrol agent shifted his attention from the surfers to William, the 4-year-old, and then said, stop. You heard, stop, do not go any further. There was some sort of like invisible line that neither of us saw. And so William stopped, but then, being the 4-year-old that he is, he then continued running. And then the Border Patrol agent said, stop. Then he really realized that it was the agent was serious. So he stopped and he sat down in the sand, and then we just sat there and talked about it for a minute. And then he looked over at the wall. Again, the wall is made of like metal, like steel bollards. And he looked at the wall and he said, why can't we take an excavator? Because he just learned that word, excavator, and crush that wall. And then he said, and then turn the material, then turn it into bikes. So he turned the wall into bikes. And to me, that statement alone, I think deserves, it really became the spirit of this book. This idea that why is all this going into this when it could be something else, when it could be transformed into something else that would be much more valuable and much more helpful to the well-being of humankind. And so that's in a nutshell. And then to kind of tie it together with storming the wall, if you take, why can't you turn the wall into bikes and then apply it to the border, the budgets, the $330 billion that CBP and ICE have gone to CBP and ICE in the last 20 years since DHS was started. Like, what other things could that go to that could be much better for the world in general? And you could think of so many, when like thinking of security, what does security mean? Like when you think of, how people feel secure, I would put a lot of things in there, like, why are children drinking contaminated water in places like Flint, Michigan? Or why isn't there enough affordable housing for people in so many different places around the country? And particularly, I see it here on the West Coast and in California, or all kinds of different ways that this money could be a bike instead of a wall, right? That could be used differently. And by divesting in the border wall, you can invest in so many other things. And then when you think of climate, when you go back to climate change and think of climate change, when one of the things that I did in looking at in storming the wall particularly, and since then really, is look at different assessments that come from agencies about how climate change is going to impact the United States. One that really is vivid that comes to mind every single time I bring this up is a 2003 Pentagon Commission report that was looking at the worst case scenario of climate change. And according to this report, they said in these sorts of worst case scenarios that the United States would have to build a defensive fortress around, and then to stop, quote unquote, unwanted starving immigrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. And they say the Caribbean is a especially severe problem. And those sorts of assessments, now that one, now they're more polished. Maybe the language is a little bit more polished. They don't say unwanted starving immigrants quite like that anymore, but they say the same thing, a lot of the assessments. I just read one from the National Threat Assessment, the annual National Threat Assessment, which is it's from the Directorate of the Intelligence Community of the U.S. government, and they do this annual report of threats. And I looked at the threat assessment for 2021, and I put the word migration in the search thing, and it came up 18 times. And then they even specifically mentioned all the stuff what I'm mentioning earlier about what was happening in Guatemala and Honduras, particularly around the hurricanes. And they specifically mentioned the hurricanes, and they talked about surges of people coming to the border, that sort of thing. And if you look at those assessments, you also see as focuses on Haitian people arriving to the border, especially in Del Rio, Texas, as we've been seeing in the last couple of weeks. If you just look at climate alone, again, I would defer more to the catastrophic convergence of many different things. But the climate in like Haiti has just been nailed by not only earthquakes and the severe earthquakes that have happened in the country, but also by weather disasters time and time again. They're the number one country as far as they're shared it with Myanmar of countries that were most vulnerable to climate change in the world between, I think, 2007 and 2018 or something like that. So those sorts of this sort of idea that climate change is a threat is or as the military speak goes, is a quote unquote threat multiplier, and meaning that the event, the hurricane is less concerning unless it's hitting a military base to the military apparatus or the border apparatus than what happens in the aftermath of what people do in the aftermath. And thus it's a threat multiplier. So thus the idea of threat, and thus then these justifications to build up the border more and more. As you can see, and if you look in the Department of Homeland Security, they have all those documents of preparing for mass migrations, looking specifically at disaster-related mass migration. And so when you think of those sorts of things and think of this climate adaptation as it's being put forth, and then think about this idea of build bikes, not walls, this idea that there are just so many different ways. Like if you take all that money just from a budgetary standpoint and started putting it into climate financing, for example, and if people might remember that in 2009, there was an agreement made between the high income countries to put at least to have a goal of $100 billion by 2020 to put in a fund for countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, including countries that are experiencing sea level rise and that are particularly in dire need of some sort of adaptation. And those, it seems like, as when you look at all these different things that are going on, that all this money going into like border and immigration enforcement everywhere. I've been focusing on the United States, but you could look everywhere and it's just increasing. Why can't it just be funded into other things? Mitigation, adaptation, looking at different ways to move forward. And really that's one of the conclusions of Build Bridges Not Walls, that the borders themselves, the way that the nation states are set up, and you can look at it from a climate perspective, and this is how I'll end today, and then we'll go into questions. But looking at from the nation states and this sort of perspective, the response to over what has it been? This is a 26th UN summit, and emissions are still rising in so many places, and you have the report saying there has to be transformative change happening now, and yet you have countries that are powerful, that are beholden to fossil fuel companies, that are calling the shots, and things still just keep kind of in a kind of status quo. the border system, and to think of it as a climate adaptation plan, if you look around the world, where they're located, how they're placed, how they're deployed, what countries they're put up against, you can start to see it as a scaffolding for a status quo, a scaffolding for business as usual, a scaffolding where, in a world where the rich have been getting, to put it maybe too simply, the rich have been getting richer, the poor have been getting poorer, and this kind of keeps it in place. And the high emitting countries keep emitting, and even, okay, we're going to have these catastrophes and people are going to be on the move, but we're going to have this whole web of border apparatus around the globe, and that will just keep people in their place. It seems to me, when you start looking at that and start really looking at that seriously, you're not talking about any sort of sustainable world in any sort of sense. And you have, like right now, you have Border Patrol saying, well, we're going to have solar panels on our surveillance towers, or we're going to, have like green energy. And that's just like, okay, a green energy fueled apparatus, while the whole thing kind of stays the same. And what I think I'm in fact insisting upon is that sort of world, you're not going to come up with what we need to do, and if we're like to move in a way where at least, I understand when you talk about open borders or no borders, it's very, very, very stigmatized, especially in certain sectors, especially in the United States. But what I say to that is go talk to somebody who says, well, let's put a border wall between Rhode Island or let's put a border wall between Pennsylvania and Ohio, and see how people react to that. Like, this idea of impeding the freedom of movement of people is actually very not natural at all. And you can, like, remember when Rhode Island at the beginning of COVID said they were going to track every single New York license plate that came over the border into Rhode Island and find out where they are and then question them and test them. And remember what Andrew Cuomo did, the former governor? He said he freaked out, really. He freaked out because it's so, like, the idea of a border being placed upon you is ridiculous from those sorts of, those sorts of like vantage points. I'm not talking about quarantine and confining in that sort of public health sense. I'm talking about borders between political entities. And so I know this is the book itself, Bill Bridges Not Walls, is not meant to be, it's not meant to be like, oh, I have the solution. It's more that these questions need to be posed. These sorts of things need to be talked about. And this is why I so enjoy giving presentations like this, because I really do think this is what needs to happen. These things need to be put in debate. Like, what are different ways, like giving the real threats that we have in this century? What are the real ways that we can do it? And I argue that this border system that we have in place and this increased militarization of borders is actually fomenting and keeping a status quo of an unjust world. And one of the ways to alleviate that injustice is to begin to remove those, maybe in small increments, maybe in small steps, but that it needs to go in that direction rather than the direction that it's going. And I'll leave it at that for now, and we can have questions and comments and discussion.
I think we'll open it now. Thank you so much, Todd. This has been incredible. I think we want to open it up now for the students to talk to you a little bit. And also people are putting comments on the chat, so maybe we'll have time to address those as well.
Okay, perfect.
So Jordan, Brittany, Isabel, and Cristal, take it away.
Sure, I can go ahead and start with my question, only because you started to hit on this a little bit toward the end, but I also want to bring back, so you mentioned in Build Bridges Not Walls that the COVID-19 pandemic itself almost can provide an opportunity, and it has uplifted a lot of the issues that we've mentioned today, because a lot of these issues have been exacerbated as a result of the ongoing pandemic. And so I was wondering, what steps can we take as students or as community members to make sure that the lessons that we're being taught right now aren't made a thing of the past and aren't forgotten?
Oh, that's a great question, because that's always the fear, right? Because the pandemic it's so intense, and the learning is also so intense, and then all of a sudden, there. I even remember myself last year feeling like these sense almost like when you can feel like the biochemistry of learning new things. I just remember feeling it like very intensely last year, and sometimes I want to write an essay and just and try to, and I actually do, but to try to think about what I was thinking. The question is good, because I would say that is a silver lining to a lot of this, and I think it's a silver lining also to climate change in general, right? Like climate change as it becomes more intense. I even feel like at the beginning, I felt silly saying that when I saw the sea going into the house was the first time I'd really recognized it, but it was. I probably had seen it before, but then I recognized it as such, and all of a sudden it changed, and then you just don't like go back, right? In a way, it's like almost a portal, and like this is from a personal level, and now I feel silly because now you just see so many things that you just can attribute to it. But the silver lining of it is that here it is, right? And the warnings are there, and the pandemic, I think, is part and parcel to this too, right? Like it's a global problem, right? That's being, again, quote unquote, solved via nation state. And so thus, like if in COVID, if you have the United States saying, oh, we're going to vaccinate everyone in the country, but the rest of the world, like 3% of the rest of the world isn't going to be vaccinated. How can you like stop? And from that point of view, how can you stop a global pandemic, right? That, of course, if it's still around, then variants happen and then they spread it. Like the pandemic itself doesn't know borders. There's this great cartoon that shows like the general with the binoculars and with the missiles on the border wall and all this stuff. And then this COVID, the spiky ball virus like floating over the border, because it just doesn't, it's a global thing, and it needs this kind of global response. And I think that's exactly, and then climate change as well. And so that I think if you apply some of the things you learned during this past year to the challenges that we have ahead of us, and think of, I'm of the point of view that it's time, like, great, there's so many dire things to look at, and we can look at those, but it's also time to like switch it around and start looking, okay, the world is now demanding that another world is created, and a world of more justice, a different world, a world where it could be just such an exciting project, especially for you students and young people, right? That are just looking into the future, and I think like looking at things as these sorts of challenges and taking learning that we get from things like the pandemic, I think they can really help us moving forward, and as we like maybe try to tackle these other bigger or like existential, we should say, problems upon us. I hope that was okay. I think that was only okay. I hope that at least inspired thought.
That was great. Thank you.
Hi, this is Jordan. I had a question that mostly pertains to, the process of the creation of these books in particular. And I usually like to ask these things of published writers, but throughout the process, and even if you want to say for today, have you had any challenges with censorship in particular, or any other things around these books? And of course, you mentioned earlier, kind of, you know, a lot of these topics are already very stigmatized, but was there any like fears or any backlash you received specifically that you wanted to talk about? And I also think, even just thinking right now of, you know, many of us here might know already a lot of people who write or do a lot of work around these topics. Often also, we know there's extremely high rates of, for example, assassinations, people going missing, censorship. And I was wondering if you experience any of these, have any of the experiences or fears around this.
Yeah, those I remember my well, not in the last part of it, I know. There's been things that have looked kind of like threats here and there, but nothing, you know, like if I think of for example, journalists across the border in Mexico, and the kind of rates of journalists being assassinated in Mexico, you know, for sometimes just doing just normal reporting. It's definitely not even remotely like that at all. However, you know, right from the get-go, writing on these contentious topics always inspire, you know, vitriol from certain sectors. And I remember when Border Patrol Nation came out, my first one, it just got, like, for the beginning, it just got attacked. Just attacked over and over again. I think the Border Patrol Union, I'm pretty sure this is what happened. I'm not sure, but they just started they started attacking the Amazon page, really, and leaving 1-star reviews and just writing all this stuff like, this book sucks, and I wasted my, one guy wrote, I think he was a guy, his name was a guy, but he wrote, I wasted 8 hours of my life reading this book. And I thought, oh, I mean, that must have been a page turner for you if you read it. You read that book in 8 hours. The reason why I figured out it was Border Patrol, because there was a guy that I actually interviewed, a former agent, who actually made a comment as well. And I could tell he didn't really realize it was the same person who interviewed him. And so that's how I'm like, okay, this is Border Patrol, and probably it's on the retire. So that's what happens, you know. There's this pile-ons, and that's what's happened to me occasionally. Pile-ons, and after things are published, more that happen, and then they come in waves, and sometimes you look at something, and I know, like, I had all, in that particular case, I had all that happen, and then I was going to go on a book tour, and then I thought, oh God, you know, what's going to happen on this book tour? Because it comes at you so intensely, and you think, oh God, and then nothing happened on the book tour. But that's how I've gotten hecklers at book tours and on book events, and a lot of them. And one in the Empire, like Patricia mentioned, the Empire of Borders, the first launch, the book launch of that, a man showed up with a large machete to the event with a Confederate flag tattooed on his arm. So those sorts of things occasionally happen in that sense. I do think there's another sort of censorship that happens that's more subtle, that if a lot of, you know, some of the media these days, you know, will take a very partisan look at things, and I say this as somebody who's journalism. I would do look pretty critically at the Democrats and how the Democrats have you know, fared over the years on these issues as well. And I'm not saying there's been censorship, but sometimes you can feel like doing the journalism that really tries to look at it straightforwardly and hit on and just look at things as they are. And sometimes it, you know, everyone gets gets the is in the crosshairs really. And I don't know, it sometimes seems, I don't know, sometimes I wonder that, I guess I should say, I don't have any confirmations that has happened, but I do wonder from time to time. That's a question you can go on for a while, but it's a very interesting question about process and thinking us. And
thank you so much for sharing.
Sorry, Brittany. Thank you, Todd, for coming out and speaking to us. It's, definitely both of your books are very interesting, and it got me thinking about a lot of just information that, people generally don't know. Thank you for enlightening us about, because now we're angry and we're upset. So now I think it's definitely gonna lead us into a time of definite transition. But I wanted to ask the question, kind of going off of what Jordan had asked previously. Well, at the beginning of the presentation, Professor Macias mentioned that you had been reporting on different borders for over 25 years. And I had looked up your other books prior to today. So I was like, this is like your subject of expertise. And I was just wondering what inspired you to write just on the borders, and how did this all start?
Yeah, there's the long answer, the medium answer. But thanks for your question and thanks for your words. I appreciate them. I guess, well, I like, one thing is I actually grew up on the Canadian border, and that it was quite different. And now it's shifted, because I've written on the Canadian border now, and it's really shifted especially post 9/11 in many different ways that we don't have the time to get into. But like the whole idea of like constantly looking over the Niagara River. I grew up in Western New York, Buffalo area. It did have an influence. We were just constantly kind of crossing the borders and getting, sometimes, things would happen in that. We'll just leave it at that. And so there's those parts of it. I think my grandparents too, I'm not going to go into it too much because I'm just trying to be brief, but particularly my grandmother from the Philippines, who came undocumented to the United States, and then were persistently throughout my childhood traveling everywhere and bringing back kind of, different stories of different places. And of course, that story of their journey from the Philippines to US, and that influenced me. And then I just had this I just was following another huge thing was I went to live in Mexico, and I lived in Mexico for a year in the late 1990s, and that year in Mexico, really, among many other things, one of the big learnings was being able to view my country from outside of its borders, while learning and listening and talking to so many people about their stories coming up against that border. And then it just from then on, it was pretty much I shifted into being really uber focused on what this thing is. And soon thereafter, I ended up, it was in Tucson, and soon thereafter I met Patricia for the first time, and just really started focusing on it, going with groups. I actually started writing in local newsletters about different situations and joining different organizations, including Patricia. Was it Swarm or BAN? There's an organization through which I met Patricia. And and, you know, just getting involved in different organizations. And I ended up working in a binational organization that did a lot of cross-border stuff, and just kept writing and writing throughout it all. And then it's a really long story, so but I ended up going and living in Mexico for a while and looking at justice and economic issues. And then it just really all of this just came together, and I just began writing on all of this, and it all kind of came together at the border. And then another thing about it is that the border, I didn't intend to write 4 books on it, right? It's something that just like I wrote one, and you think, okay, that's going to be it. And then every book has opened up new huge things. Like this thing it just reveals itself as bigger and bigger and bigger. Because in Border Patrol Nation, I hardly looked at climate change at all. And then I shifted over to climate change and looked at the borders. I'm like, oh my God, there's this whole other world of stuff. And so that's Storming the Wall came out of that. And then you start looking at the international stuff and like, wow, this externalization, you know, the border, it's more of like less of it. Border, US-Mexico border is one little part of this massive border regime, and so on and so forth. It just becomes the subject is just bigger than I thought it was. And now I know, right? Now I know it's huge, and I can explain it that way, but it's like, okay, now I each book sets a foundation for the next one. At least that's what's happened until now. But I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Todd, I just wanted to mention just how important that political work was with the Southwest Alliance to Resist Militarization and the Border Action Network that you were involved with, because in some ways that's the organization that eventually helped to bring about like the work that Puente now does in Arizona and things like that. So, I mean, the perspective you have is so important, because you were there at a time when that whole region was being militarized. And so, yeah, I just think your work is so important. And to hear about how you're finding your voice as a writer, I think is also really helpful to hear.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you, of course, so much for your presentation and being here with us today. We really appreciate it. I was really curious because I know, I'm sure yourself as a writer and us in academic circles, we spend a lot of time, of course, doing research, as you've done. It's very important, and discussing these things. But what I'm very curious about is what you think us as students and members of the UIC community can do to actually make the knowledge that you brought to us actionable, and to create change in terms of the issues that you focused on moving into the future.
Yeah, the question, you know, the ultimate question, right? Yeah, I mean, like in one way, what I hope for, I mean, as a journalist who writes these books, is that, you know, I hope that the books inspire people to think of what that might look like, right? To come, like, by writing the book itself, you know, hopefully, oh, here's this stuff or information, and then you give it out to the world. And one of my hopes is that, okay, or this probably what you're hitting on is probably my main hope, is that it's transformative, that it's goes out there and it's alive, right? Like the book itself, when I release it, it's like no longer mine in a lot of ways. It's just alive. And then by being alive, I mean that it goes to different places, and that there's like, I don't know, like what the you know, different actionable items are in any different place, right? Like, I'm not sure what it is in Chicago, but I could give it a guess. But what I hope, like what the hope is, at least, is that it hopefully it inspires to think a lot on these issues, and then think of like what can you do in your locality, what kind of different things, what kind of things already exist, because there's so many pre-existing you know, structures out there. Like if you know, you think of in terms of anything, right? Climate change. If you look at these two subjects of climate change and immigration, you look anywhere and there's so many things going on, so many ways that people can be involved, so many things that people can do, either both individually or like as a group or as a movement, right? And sometimes it's all of those coming together that seem to have the most power, right? I guess maybe that is a movement when all these things come together. And yeah, I mean, that's a hope. I think there's like in this last book, Build Bridges Not Walls, a lot of the focus I was on, I surprisingly, even to my own self, turned to really individual things like treating other people with kindness, like how that in its own right defies this border apparatus, right? And I know that that's not going to shift all the big challenges we're talking about, but that's an actionable thing that I could go out and do in my daily life. And then along with being involved with this or that, or writing something or doing, I mean, I think each person, I honestly believe like each person has their own talent or has their own gift or has something that they can really bring to the table. And but for really things to happen, I really do believe like there's got to be organizers out there, like you say, coming up with what is actionable, coming up with plans to do things, to look at all the different facets of what those plans, like all the different facets from legislative to like civil disobedience to all the other different things that people can do and connect and bring multiple people into the equation. I know that my answer might be vague, but that's like, as a journalist, I just hope, that's what I hope. I just set things out there and I hope there's a kind of reaction to it or a response to it that leads to exactly what you're hinting at.
Thank you, Todd Miller, for your thoughtful responses, and to the students who moderated the conversation. It looks like we have a few more minutes to engage today. Because we are on Zoom, if you have a comment or a question, please continue to submit them by using the Q&A Zoom or the chat features, and the LCC staff will do our best to share any comments or questions with Todd. We do have some responses to some of what you've shared. It sounds like folks are making connections to their own lives. So we'll read a couple of those and see if there's any reactions from you, Todd. Sandra Morales shared in the beginning, this reminds me of how communities in Guatemala are also being impacted by rivers being polluted by corporations that divert for private irrigation by growers. In regards to the money spent on CBP and ICE, Fermin Valle said, imagine if 300 billion was spent on resources and development for BIPOC communities instead. Within that same conversation with CBP and ICE, Will Marie said, Border Patrol using solar panels and embracing green infrastructure in their work is greenwashing for injustice. And then the last comment I'll read before we get some of your reaction is from Aixa Alfonso. Is it not ironic that the level of threat from white supremacists is at its highest level as well, when you were speaking about the catastrophic convergence of many things?
Yeah, I think those are all very insightful.
There are a couple
comments.
of questions in the Q&A chat too, Jorge. I just wanted to know.
Yes, we can. Well, Todd, do you want to respond to any of those comments before we read some more things to you?
Oh, thank you for they're very insightful, and I think they bring up different angles to what and ideas about from how this massive amount of money can be spent in so much better ways. When you think of CBP and ICE to like all the different like converging factors. I remember I was in Guatemala and ran into a protest who was talking about the rivers being polluted from African palm plantations that were downstream, those sorts of things. So all those points are very well taken. Thank you for making them.
Hi, Todd. This is Lauren from the LCC. And I just wanted to also share one of the questions that was in the Q&A. So Jesse Vega Gonzalez shared as a comment, basically the absurd budget, military, and migration services can be used to stop these problems, stop the problems these two entities supposedly prevent. And the question was, are these decisions on border control and its militarization based upon controlling immigrants crossing the border? Or are these actions made to satisfy the economical needs and agreements made with those providing supply to Border Patrol?
Oh yeah, that good question. I mean, that's the, I believe you're insinuating bringing in the private industry part of it, the companies that are making profit off of this vast amount of money going into this border militarization. And that's really, really is something to look into. The amount of contracts that are going into this. I have this number actually fresh in my mind: 105,000 contracts issued by CBP and ICE between 2008 and 2020, amounting to $55 billion, which is a lot of contracts, right? And that's more than like 27 years of border and immigration enforcement budgets going from 1975 to 2002. So there's been this shift, and I argue that there's a border industrial complex, you could call it a border immigration industrial complex, and the same companies are getting big contracts. They also have tremendous influence in Washington. They lavish funds upon candidates when they're running for office, whether it be a presidential, presidential candidates or key Congress people in key committees. They also are able to lobby when appropriations, like the budget bills, are being debated and that sort of thing. So that sort of influence is huge. And I think it definitely, it always surprises me when these issues are brought up, that part of it, that there's a profit motive to this as well, is not a part of like any sort of immigration reform bill. And I think I really think that, given like what we know that's going into it, it should be a big part of it. So thanks for that question.
Another question that we have submitted is, I think you've talked a good amount about this, but I'll read it in case there's something you want to add. You've written about how 9/11 precipitated changes that have had a huge impact on militarization of the border and expansion of state security powers. With the anniversary of 9/11 just passed, what are your thoughts now on prospects to reconsider or roll back some of the police and surveillance powers that were expanded?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to ask me and I want me to answer honestly, I would just love to see DHS be completely dissolved. It's just like the whole thing and the powers that it brought, and for example, CBP and ICE and any agency under CBP or under DHS, their priority missions became counterterrorism and stopping weapons of mass destruction from crossing the borders. And so this, even, these sorts of powers that came to them and via the powers of what they could do, but also the kind of budgets that they had at their disposal, they just skyrocketed, even though, as we all know, there's just no incidents of weapons of mass destruction crossing our border or any sort of quote unquote terrorist. So I think, like, honestly, that there's so many things we can go into as far as that's concerned. But my stance would be definitely that money could be put to much better use elsewhere, and that's what I would like to see.
Thanks. And I think just given time, we'll read one more. Let me see. This was a question in the Q&A. Has abolition or decolonial perspectives ever been part of your work or been of thought concerning settler state of the USA?
Yeah, particularly in the last two books, Empire of Borders, from a decolonization perspective and looking at the colonial origins of almost all borders. That the origin story is almost some sort of European power imposing a border, in some different place. So I look into that in Empire Borders quite a bit. And then the abolition part, I really do look at in Build Bridges Not Walls, the newest book. The whole last section is called Abolition. And what I really do is try to look at some abolitionist thought pertaining to really applying some abolitionist thought, especially looking at, the long tradition of prison abolition in the more modern sense of the term abolition, right? And in prison abolition and applying that to borders, like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, for example, and looking at like the work that Gilmore has done over the years, and this, especially like Gilmore's contention of creating a world of justice, and a world of justice, then prisons, the quote unquote need for prisons dissolve. And when you apply that to borders, in a world of justice, the borders just kind of dissolve. And so those sorts of abolitionist perspectives are to me are quite profound. I know there's multiple ways to look at them and see them, but I find them very, very effective, and I recommend as we look at borders, and of course borders and the incarceration apparatus attached to them, and all of that, and I think the literature and the practice and the movements around different issues can be very much used in this way too.
Thank you so much, Todd, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all of them, but we'll make sure that we share the rest of the comments and questions with Todd.
Thank you.
I'll send it back to Rosa so we can come to a conclusion.
Yeah, thank you, Todd, for speaking to us, and help us connect the dots between climate-driven migration and the dreadful climate adaptation that governments, especially the US, are taking to position climate-displaced people as a threat, and responding with more militarization on borders, but also for leaving us with some very existential questions, like what happens to our collective humanity when the impulse to help one another is criminalized. I know that this is one of the main, like you said before, the main questions in your last book. And also inciting us to think about how do we transform borders into bridges to make the world a more sustainable and livable place for all. So thank you for leaving us with that. And I also would like to thank the students panelists and the LCC staff, the Humanities Action Lab, and thank you to all of you listening for sharing a space, curiosity, and most important purpose, right? To build and sustain collective solidarity, to imagine and demand bold and equitable climate policy solutions. I hope you can join us in our next Climates of Inequality presentation, which is scheduled for Wednesday, October 13 at 4:30. Our guest speakers will be Jose Bravo with Just Transition Alliance, which will be a really nice link to the conversation today here with that. And you remember, you can register in the LCC website, where you will also be able to find today's recording. Probably give us a week to do that, but also the previous recordings. So I think now, just to stay with us for a couple of minutes for the raffle of the two books, Building Bridges, Not Walls, and Storming the Walls. Thank you again, Todd, and everybody else who is here with us tonight.
Thank you.
As Rosa mentioned, we'll now be raffling a copy of Building Bridges, Not Walls, and a copy of Storming the Wall. We'll be using the sign-in sheet to pick the two winners. Todd, if you could just pick two numbers between 1 and 44.
31 and 15.
31 and 15. Lauren, could you announce the winners?
Yeah, so it looks like 15 is Ashley Cruz. And 31, you said, is Shayla Santos. So yay to our raffle winners. The LCC team will communicate with you via email about retrieving your books. So congratulations.
Again, thank you all for joining us. This brings today's program to a close. Thank you again to Todd Miller and everyone involved in making today's program possible. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.